Good evening. Good evening, everyone. How are you?
Good.
Good. I'm Anthony Crowell. I'm the Dean and President here at New York Law School, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you tonight for a very special event featuring my friend and former colleague, Bradley Tusk, as we celebrate the publication of his new book entitled Vote with Your Phone: Why Mobile Voting is Our Final Shot at Saving Democracy. And you see this book with all these little stickies that are notations. This is what happens when Ben Max goes to law school. Thank you for letting me borrow this pen.
Both weren't yours?
I usually just Bradley's going to discuss his book tonight with Ben, who is our executive editor at the Center for New York City and State Law, which, as you know, was recently renamed to expand on the great work of 30 years that Ross Sandler founded in 1994, known as the Center for New York City Law. And we are looking forward to an expansive array of new programs and new publications and opportunities to provide our constituency and the public with a deeper degree of analysis and commentary on all things New York City and state, with a special emphasis on the relationship, sometimes symbiotic, sometimes, what shall we say, tension. There's tension, and there's a lot of controversy in the relationship between the city and the state. So the complex intergovernmental dynamics will be something that we really zero in on to make sense of for the public. I'm also really proud that New York Law School is at the center of providing this kind of programming. For 133 years, we've been known as New York's Law School, really providing extraordinary public service opportunities for our students and embracing our alumni, many of whom have gone into the highest levels of public service and delivered extraordinary opportunities for New York to advance itself as a leader in policy and law. And so we're very pleased about that. I'm really proud that we have Bradley here tonight as well. His accomplishments are extraordinarily impressive. He is somebody who I've always known to be smart and focused, and I've admired his work. We worked together back in 2002, excuse me, 2002. I had a Charter Revision Commission, and we were just using that. The work we did in that summer really focused on mayoral succession and special elections. And it's an interesting moment in our city's history with so much going around in terms of question marks about the current crisis that is facing the city and whether we'll have to invoke any of those provisions. Hopefully that won't be the case, but it's interesting to see that the work we did back then is as relevant as ever, and it's something that we can look to help guide us through to the future. I will say that Bradley's book is something that I know will captivate all of you. Whether you know much about mobile voting or not, it is something that will prove to be not only intellectually engaging, but it will really be something for you all to think about in terms of how it can transform the body politic, how it can make our democracy more accessible, more fair, and how we can put in the hands of everyday people their ability to vote and uphold the rule of law for the future. So I think democracy is at stake with the kinds of questions that Bradley raises in his book and the opportunity that mobile voting can present. So without any further ado, I will ask Ben and Bradley to engage in a terrific discussion. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dean Crowell. Thank you all for being here tonight. Appreciate your interest in this topic and this speaker. And Bradley, thank you for writing this book. I was reading this book and just my wheels were just turning the entire time, whether I agreed with what you said or disagreed or just didn't understand some of it because of the cybersecurity elements that I'm trying to work my way through. So it's really just a very engaging read and a lot to think about here. Again, I'm Ben Max. I'm the executive editor and program director at the Center for New York City and State Law here at New York Law School. Thank you, Dean Crowell, for the opening remarks and for bringing me to New York Law School less than a year ago. It's been great to be here, and we're working on expanding our programming and a whole lot more. So please stay tuned and look out for more from us as we move forward, and that includes bringing in authors for interesting talks about their books. So before we even get into mobile voting, just say a little bit about your background in politics and what moment or two in politics gave you the type of realization that eventually leads you to this book where you're talking about saving democracy. Yeah. You have a vast array of experiences. I'm not going to go through Bradley's whole bio and resume here, but we'll touch on some of it as we talk. But you have a vast array of experiences in politics and government, and now in the private sector as well. And you come to some pretty stark realizations here that have led you down this path. So say a little bit about some of those moments in your career that have led you to this point.
Sure. I would say there's probably maybe three specifically that to me were really eye-opening. So the first one was I was Structured Communications Director in the Senate. And that I think is considered among the hardest and worst jobs in Washington. And there's this joke: the most dangerous place to be is between Chuck Schumer and a TV camera. And although I think now working for Trump's got to be harder than working for Chuck. But after a few months, I remember really struggling those first few months with the job, just trying to figure out what he wanted and what the job was about. And then one day it just hit me this job has nothing to do with policy or legislation or even politics. It is solely that when Chuck wakes up in the morning and he sees his name in the newspaper, he feels better about himself, and if he doesn't, he feels worse about himself. And my job is to make him feel good about himself. And fundamentally, that's what he needed from the job, and that was his primary motivation for everything he does. And by the way, I think Chuck, in a lot of ways, is an exemplary lawmaker, but he also, from a psychological standpoint to me, is like the absolute epitome of a politician. And he is never going to put filling that hole in his psyche, behind getting anything done or anything else. So that was useful. The second was when I was the deputy governor of Illinois. I worked for a guy named Rod Blagojevich, who became quite famous for the wrong reasons. And Rod had this view of politics that was both totally crazy and yet in some ways actually highly rational, which was he separated the job of running for office for the job from holding office, and he truly believed that his job was to run for office. And he would say, I did my job, I'll see you guys again in 4 years, and he meant it. I mean, he wouldn't come to the office for months at a clip. He had zero interest in governing. A lot of it then fell to me, and I was 29 and really had no business doing all the things that I was doing, but somebody had to do them, so might as well be me. But that kind of also let me realize that these are two separate things, and conflating them doesn't make sense, and that fundamentally, as much as a politician might care about a particular issue or policy or bill, it's always secondary to what they see as their real job, which is running for office. And the third was when I was running all the campaigns to legalize Uber around the US, and we were able to mobilize millions of our customers to weigh in with their elected officials and say to them, hey, I like this Uber thing, don't take it away from me. And the kind of realization there was, it's not that people are so apathetic that they won't ever do anything, it's that they're only going to go to so much effort to express themselves, to advocate, to vote, and if you make it really easy, a lot more of them will do it, which is ultimately kind of what led to the mobile voting project.
Thank you. When you write about politics, you write about politics in many places, but including this book, you write about sort of your very basic theory of politics and what motivates politicians and what leads us to outcomes. Say a little bit about what that.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
It's very simple.
We see it play out in complicated ways. But
Sure. So, and there's a chapter through the book is literally what you're talking about. It's the 10 rules that demystify politics. And the first one really drives the rest of it, which is every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. Are there exceptions? Absolutely. I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager, ran for mayor. I think Mike was an exception. I've worked with others, but by and large, that is pretty much what I've seen. And again, I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch in New New York, DC, Philly, Chicago. Like, I really do feel like I have seen the system from lots of different angles here. And ultimately, if you want a politician to do something, they have to genuinely believe that doing what you want will either help them win their next election, or not doing what you want could cost them their next election. And if you can get them to believe either of those two things, they will work with you. And if you can't get them to believe those two things, you don't matter. And I think trying to look at it in a more idealistic way, as much as we all might like to, right, ultimately doesn't get you what you need to get done. And so I think a lot of people accuse my view of politics of being very cynical, but I also think that history has very much proven it out. And rather than, just like we pretend that politicians should do the right thing ahead of doing what's best for them, and as a result we keep having school shootings and Walmart shootings and church shootings and whatever else, let's stop pretending that they're not who they are. Let's accept them for who they are, which is very, very human. And then let's build a system that still makes it in their interest to do what's right.
So that theory ties right into your assessment of sort of how politics is dominated today.
Yes.
And what mobile voting, which is really a strategy to increase voter turnout,
Yep.
Is all about solving.
Yes.
The parties are dominated by the extremes.
Yep.
Legislative gerrymandering has led to very few competitive general elections. And so what do we get in politics and government is, well, in some states you're dominated by one party, in some states another. In the federal government you have lots of gridlock because the Democrats sent there are mostly adherent towards the further left, and the Republicans sent there are mostly adherent toward the further right. Say a little bit about that assessment and why we're where we are today in your view in terms of those turnout problems.
I mean, it's math, basically, right? Which is because of gerrymandering, and if we could get rid of gerrymandering, that could solve a lot of problems, but the Supreme Court has made it clear that they're not going to do so, and at least given the makeup of this current court and the ages of a lot of the justices, that's not changing anytime soon. So that really means that we're stuck with the primaries being the actual election that matters in the vast majority of cases. And primary turnout in this country is typically about 10 to 15%. And like you said, those are the extremes. So three groups end up being dominant: the far left, the far right, or special interests that know how to move money and votes in low turnout primaries. And that gets us either, like you said, the utter chaos and dysfunction of Washington, D.C., or it gets us totally one-sided government, and whether it's the city of San Francisco on the left or the state of Texas on the right, I don't think any of that is good. I don't think any of that is representative of who we are. But what's also interesting to me is it's not actually reflective of who we are broadly, right? So if you were to ask 70 to 80% of Americans would say we should neither confiscate everyone's guns, nor should you be able to walk into a store and easily walk out with an assault rifle. That 70 to 80% of Americans don't vote in primaries, therefore their view doesn't matter. 70 to 80% of Americans would say we should neither deport everyone here illegally, nor should we have open borders. Again, they don't vote in primaries, their views don't matter. Even abortion, the third rail of our politics, the single most controversial issue we have, 2/3 of Americans say there should be a right to abortion. Now you can debate 8 weeks versus 16 versus 24, that's fine, but the fundamental precept really isn't, even that is not that controversial, but again, those people typically aren't voting in primaries. And so we have a world where the extremes both decide who wins office and they dictate what they do when they're in office. And I'm working on a very simple premise, which is right now, if you're a Republican congressman from Florida, and to be clear, I'm an independent, I dislike both parties intensely, and I beat up on both of them continually in this book, so the fact that I'm leading in with a Republican example is not indicative of anything. But turnout in your primary is 12%. Half those people are NRA members. You know, you understand that it's fucking crazy that someone can walk into a store and walk out with an AK-47, but you also know that if you were to ever dare say that, you're out in your next primary. In fact, Chris Jacobs is a Republican congressman, tells the story of this in the book, from the Buffalo area. Super Trumper, MAGA guy all the way. There was a mass shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo 2 years ago. 10 people died. Jacobs' office was about a mile from the supermarket. He was shaken by it, as you would hope someone would be. And he said in a press conference, we ought to look at some new laws. He wasn't able to run for re-election that November. The Republican conservative ballot lines were stripped from him. And yet, if in his primary or any Republican primary, if turnout were 36% instead of 12, just doing the math, the NRA's vote share goes from 50% down to 16%. And then their power is significantly dissipated. And then if you just look at polling of Republicans, you might not then get overall support for an assault weapons ban, but you would certainly get a lot of support for a lot more common sense restrictions. Or let me give you one even closer to home, and it's also a story in the book. In 2019, as you well remember, Amazon wanted to put their second headquarters here in Queens on Long Island City. And when you look at the majority of the polling for the city as a whole, and even the district specifically, overwhelming support. Yes, of course, we should take all of these jobs. But AOC comes out against it, and Mike Gianaris, who's the state senator from Long Island City, who is a smart guy, but I would say he's neither inherently good nor evil, he's just a politician. He looks at it and says, oh no, everyone who follows AOC are the same people who would vote in a primary if I had one. And all of those people are wildly left-wing. And if I were to now support this deal, I'm risking her running someone against me or someone just choosing to run against me in a primary, and I could lose because I'm not taking that position. And he ultimately had a choice. 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one for himself, and he picked the one job for himself. But if turnout in his primary were 30% instead of 10, just based on the polling in his district, he would have to been for the deal simply because in order to stay in office. So I don't think we can make Chris Jacobs or Mike Gianaris or any of these different people or better people. And my guess is that in the Greek Senate and in the Roman Senate, they had the same personality. The people who run for office because they have a very specific kind of personality, and there's something just very specific that they need to get out of it. So rather than hoping that they'll be different, let's just recognize they're going to do what's in their interest, and then let's line up the public interest with their interest.
So mobile voting.
Yes.
How does mobile voting do that?
Yeah.
And there are, and you go through this, which is really interesting, there's a lot of election and voting reforms out there, right? And some are happening in different jurisdictions already, some are being talked about on the national level, and you're basically supportive of all of them.
Pretty much, yeah.
But this is your answer where you landed.
Yeah, absolutely.
To fix those problems.
And they're not mutually exclusive, so I think ranked choice voting is great. I think open primaries are great. I think Final Five are great. In fact, Rob Ritchie, who's sort of the godfather of ranked choice voting, has an essay in this book. Catherine Gell, who's the creator of Final Five, has an essay in this book, right? So, I mean, clearly we're all very aligned. But at the end of the day, I just don't think that any reform in and of itself is going to get people who otherwise wouldn't show up to vote to now go somewhere, right? If you have to go somewhere in order to do it, you know, the system being slightly different, that now I can list 4 people instead of 1 isn't going to change your decision. You're not going to now say, now I won't take my kid to school on Tuesday, or now I will be late for work, or whatever it is. And so getting them to go somewhere else, I think is just not realistic. People will do that in a presidential. And by the way, the one election where we don't need mobile voting is the presidential, because you're going to have turnout well north of 60%. And while even that should be higher, it's pretty good, right? But everything else, city council primary turnout last year in New York City was 7.2%. We are the greatest city in the world. We have 8.5 million people, and you could win a city council seat with 7,000 votes in a primary. That's pathetic, it's humiliating, it's embarrassing.
So before you go any further, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of mobile voting in just one second, but that to me says there's some gap between the people that care about the election for president and people that just don't care about their city council election, or haven't been convinced to care, or there's just an apathy involved.
Yeah, so a few things. So one is, some people have said to me, well, why can't, if voting shouldn't be so easy, and you should have to put in the effort to do it. And if you said to me either, turnout's really low, but we have an incredibly high functioning, we're Singapore, we have this incredibly high functioning government, I said, all right, it's working, fine. Or if you said, government's kind of broken, but everyone is voting, they're all showing up, then clearly my underlying thesis is wrong, in which case you don't need me and you don't need mobile voting. But neither of them are the case, right? We have a dysfunctional government and we have a dysfunctional voting system. And that was kind of what I learned from Uber is my assumption was apathy, but then all of a sudden here are these millions of people where, we gave them an issue that was relevant to their lives, which was they were really tired of having to go out in the street and wave their hand and hope a taxi picked them up. And by the way, one of our biggest bases of support were African Americans who had all had the experience of taxi passing them by. And they realized, if I could just press a few buttons through an app, my voice can be heard. And that's the difference. We would have lost overwhelmingly had that not been the case. So that's what said to me, yes, there's apathy, but people are willing to do certain things, so we have to meet them where they are. And look, if mobile voting couldn't be secure, then we shouldn't do it, right? And I'm not putting the code out there out in the world until we know for a fact that it is secure. But once we at least say it's as secure as paper ballots and as secure as mail-in voting, then I think to not try it would be crazy.
What's the state of mobile voting right now?
Yeah.
I knew that it was happening a little bit.
Yep.
I was actually surprised by how much it's happening.
Yeah, so so 2017 came up with the Mobile Voting Project, announced we were going to do it, and then I started looking for election officials to partner with, and in 2018, a guy named Mac Warner, who's the Secretary of State of West Virginia, and Mac is not my politics realm. Mac is a conservative, Trump, Republican, we don't really agree on very much. But Mac served in the military, all 4 of his kids served in the military, and what Mac found wildly offensive was that you're putting your life on the line to protect our right to vote. You mail in your ballot from Kandahar, it shows up 3 weeks after election day, and it goes in the trash. And he felt like, how can we not find a way for soldiers to be able to participate in the democratic process? So he said, hey, let's try it out. So in March of 2018, we had the first ever mobile voting election in the US. We're deployed military from 2 counties in West Virginia where we have to participate. Over the next couple of years, we ended up funding elections in 7 different states. We either deployed military or people with disabilities voted in an actual election. So it was West Virginia, South Carolina, Utah, so some really red states, and Oregon, Colorado, Washington, some really kind of blue states, Virginia, and a few things happened. 1, turnout increased exponentially. 2, the National Cybersecurity Center audited all of them and they all came back clean. And 3, Denver did a poll of people participated, and not shockingly, 100% said, yeah, I'd rather press a button than go somewhere. It actually would have been weird if it was not 100%. So it's been going on for a while already. Other countries do this. Estonia does it in full. In Canada, in a lot of municipal elections in Ontario, they do it. The UK, it's not how they vote for their MPs, but when the MPs then vote to pick their party leaders and the prime minister, that's how they do it. And look, 30 states have electronic voting already for overseas voters. That, I would argue, is pretty insecure because you're doing it over email, where I think there's tremendous potential for hacking. So that's not a great way to do it, and yet it's how we do it right now. And so what that kind of all led me to feel was there's an appetite for this. If we fundamentally can get more people to participate, we can change the underlying political inputs and incentives and get politicians to move towards the middle. But we've got to build tech that people feel confident is truly secure. And so for the last 4 years, that's what we've been doing. We've been building our own technology out of the Mobile Voting Project, and maybe I can just quickly show you how it works. So, let's just use New York because we're sitting here. You download the app from the New York City Board of Elections, and then the first thing they make sure is, okay, is Ben actually a registered voter in New York? Fine. Next question, is Ben Bennett, right? And so the first thing is there's multi-factor authentication. So just like if you were logging into your Google or Amazon or whatever it is, same thing happens here. Then every jurisdiction has different security measures. We have built this to be able to really accommodate a lot of security, because it seems to me, why not be able to know for sure that someone is someone? And the best way to do that is to use their own characteristics, which is forget about an ID, use their fingerprint, use a facial recognition scan. That's what we've actually done for the deployed military elections. But look, other places have other things like digital signature matching or whatever they want to do. So we built the app to be able to accommodate whatever the local jurisdiction wants to do. So now they determine, okay, Ben is really Ben. The ballot pops up on your screen. The idea is to make the ballot as simple as possible, because the goal is we want it to be really, really easy. But just by virtue of the fact that it's electronic, no hanging chads, no straight pencil marks, no undervoting, no overvoting, so all those problems that you get with paper ballots of any kind go away. Then you kind of have to verify, like, for sure this is what I want. You check it, you double check it, you can triple check it, and then when you hit submit, 2 things happen. The first thing is the ballot is immediately encrypted. The second thing is you get a tracking number, just kind of like a FedEx package, where you can track the progress of your ballot throughout the process. It then hits the Board of Elections and they take it offline. And once it's offline, which is air gapping, that means that it's no longer connected to the internet, so a third party in Moscow or Beijing or Pyongyang or whatever it is, it can't get to something if it's not connected to the internet in the first place. It's only decrypted once it's offline. Then it's a paper ballot is printed out. It's mixed in with all of the other votes, and then because the code is open source, anyone can check the code and say, okay, were there any abnormalities, any bugs, any problems? So you know. In fact, one of the reasons why I think it was necessary for me to build this philanthropically is you had companies who are in this space who are building, I think, pretty good technology, but they're businesses, and therefore their code is proprietary to them. That's how they're going to make a living, and they can't make their code open source because then all of a sudden they can't make money, and yet people in the cyber community don't feel confident in the integrity and auditability of a mobile election without the code being open source. And so I was willing and able to do that. And so that's what we've built. We've been at it for 4 years. I think we have about another 8 months of work to go. Then we will submit it to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We'll put it up at DEF CON, which is sort of the #1 hacking convention. We'll offer bug bounties so people can try to find stuff that's wrong with it. And when that's all said and done, then it's going up online, and it will be free, and any government that wants to use it can use it. They can adapt it however they need for their jurisdiction. And then the really hard work begins, which is passing this over the likely objections of everyone in power.
So let's come to that process in a second, but just so people can sort of visualize, if it goes according to plan, it's an app on your phone.
Yep.
You're already signed in, or, like people do mobile banking, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest comparison points here that people think of, right? And something that people really need to be secure, and there's certainly actors all the time trying to hack into banking entities of all kinds. But play that out for people. It's an app on your phone, like many other apps.
It's an app on your phone, except you're only going to use it once a year, twice a year, something like that. You won't stay signed in because, again, this is not like Uber Eats where you're like, okay, I'm ordering my salad every day for lunch. It'd be annoying to have to type my password every single time. We want a little bit of friction just to sort of further enhance security. But you're going to go through the address verification, the multi-factor authentication, the screening processes, and my hope would be biometric screening. And then once all of that happens, then it's kind of like any internet ballot. If you're voting for, the NBA All-Star team or American Idol or whatever it is. But yeah, it's a lot like other apps, other than the fact that, it's something that you will use kind of once in a while as opposed to all the time.
You gave an example of a foreign entity actor trying to hack in. I think, if I recall correctly, you said in the book, that's the one, you called it, I think, the one really valid concern here, correct me if I'm wrong,
sure.
Is that you have a very determined, very well-resourced foreign actor trying to mess with the U.S. elections.
Yeah, and look, that's why my view is let's start small. What I'd like to do is start running bills in cities next year where we have authorization that people can vote on their phones. And by the way, I'm not arguing to remove any form of voting. I'm just saying let's add it on top of vote by mail, machines, whatever we have, just give people another option. And let's start with school board elections. Let's start with city council elections. I am pretty sure that Vladimir Putin's not that interested in the Queensborough president election, right? And see how it works, right? Maybe it's not working, in which case we don't keep doing it, or we learn from it and we adapt it. And once we're comfortable there, we go to state elections. And then once we're finally done with that, maybe we go to congressional primaries. It may be that it's 10 years before a presidential election is mobile voting. And like I said, I'm not even sure it's that important to have mobile voting for a presidential election. I mean, the reality is, based on my experience in government, 70 to 80% of our lives in government, I'm guessing you'll agree with this, be curious if you disagree, really is determined by city and state. It's really not Washington. Washington's some very big picture stuff, but by and large, it's our mayor, it's our governor, it's our council, it's our legislature.
And that's why we're doing the work we're doing at the Center for New
Yeah,
York City and
exactly.
State Law. So
Yeah.
No.
So even if you said to me, all right, Bradley, here's how far you're going to get. We will be able to vote in state and local primaries on our phones, but no further than that, I would take that deal. Because to me, that's solving 70, 80% of the problem.
Let me play a little devil's advocate here on some of what you've outlined so far, because when you look at some of the nature of government at any level, and you look at things when they are sort of split between the two parties, by virtue of the way that conservatism is very often sort of not in favor of coming to compromise and
Yeah.
passing new legislation, because very often that's adding more government,
Yeah.
or it's various things of that nature where the parties are just sort of diametrically opposed in many ways, even if you don't have sort of the Trump takeover of the Republican Party, but more traditional Republicanism. You have that difference there.
Right.
Can higher turnout across the board really address that? Can
Yeah.
it really make for
I think
more?
it can. And by the way, so when I was deputy governor in Illinois, every year the legislature would pass about 500 bills, and we would have to review all 500 of them to decide what to do with it. And sure, 400 of them were nonsense. Like the official amphibian of Illinois is the frog. All right, hooray. And like 100 actually mattered, right?
Happens in New York. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. There's a lot of times, like for example, this is not the topic of this conversation, but like I'm strongly in favor of universal basic income because I think putting a direct wealth transfer for people who have money to people who don't is a lot more effective than a social service system and taxation and things like that. And I would really restructure government entirely. So there's a lot of government, forget about new laws, there's a lot of existing government that I would get rid of if I had a magic wand. But you have all these issues where there is consensus. Like think about immigration. There's always these bipartisan working groups because it's sort of logical. Like think about it. We clearly need more legal immigrants here because we have giant holes in our workforce, in hospitality, in construction, in nursing, and even worse, because of the population demographics, we have an incredible number of people who are now on Social Security and Medicare, and we can't afford in the current tax base to keep paying for all of them. We need millions and millions of new taxpayers in the system. At the same time, none of that argues that you have to just say everyone gets asylum or we abolish ICE or anything else. If you don't have secure borders, you're not really a country, right? And so there's a very logical sort of solution on all of this, but it gets blown up by the extremes. And look, there was a border enforcement bill that seemed like Biden was there on, and then Trump, because he was worried that actually would help Biden or therefore Harris, had his sort of allies to the very far right blow it up, and the very far left. So my brother-in-law happens to be a member of Congress, and he is very lucky because he's in one of the remaining 25 swing districts. And Josh...
He's lucky he's in the swing district?
Yeah, because he is not held hostage by... He's a Democrat,
Uh-huh.
and he is not held hostage by the far left. He is fully capable of working with the left, the right, the center. He created a group in Congress called the Problem Solvers Caucus. And when the infrastructure bill came out, Josh was really leading the fight to pass it, and even though it was $1 trillion of programs for communities all over the country, the far left tried to kill it because they wanted their social service bill to go better, which there's a lot of good stuff in there, but to come first. And so just like you had people on the far right kill a very sensible border security bill, you had people on the far left who tried very hard to do that. So I think ultimately it's not that the goal is to triple the output of legislation. The goal is to take issues where there is consensus, but yet they're still derailed by the extremes, and prevent that from happening.
I want to get to the path that you were alluding to about getting this. So you get it. You get a working app that you're really comfortable with and that's been vetted, and then you want to start passing it more. In place. I want to get to that in a second, but I wanted to ask you. You mentioned in the book. I said you're in favor of basically all of these reforms, and you listed off several of them: ranked choice voting and open primaries or nonpartisan primaries and final five voting. And if you're not familiar with these things, you can read about them in the book or lots of other places. But you mentioned very quickly compulsory voting,
Yes.
which is in place in a number of countries.
Yeah, it was funny when I was
What do you
doing the
think?
research. So it's funny when I was doing the research, I was really because I knew Australia.
Wait, there's another. What's the nicer name for it? It's like civic duty voting or something.
But and there were more countries than I expected on there. But then I also look at those countries and they're not perfect by any means. Like in a lot of ways, we're still the best country in the history of the world. We're not nearly as good as we could be because we have a dysfunctional government. So look, I think compulsory voting to me, I don't spend a ton of time on the book only because I don't see any path towards it happening. So even if you were to say, yes, this would be a good thing, and I don't know that it would be a bad thing. By the way, we have compulsory registration for the draft. You have to pay your taxes, you have to serve on jury duty. So we do have compulsory elements of society already. However, the underlying notion does feel really un-American, and as a result, like to me, of all the things to fight for, that's sort of not where I would put my political capital.
Okay. All right, outline the path to victory here for you get this app working.
Yeah.
How do you really get it to be a widespread
So one
adoption?
thing I have learned in tech, and so my day job now is I run a venture capital fund and I invest in early stage tech companies, and then I work to legalize them in different ways, is you gotta get the genie out of the bottle, right? So for Uber, we would go into a market and immediately the taxi industry would complain to the local commission and we would get hit with a cease and desist letter. You must stop right away, and we threw the letter away. Then we'd get another one and we threw the letter away. Then we'd get a third one and threw the letter. And the reason we kept doing it is we kept getting more and more customers. And once we built up enough market share, we knew we could turn those customers on to fight for us, and then we could counter all taxi's political muscle and win. And I learned that with Uber, with FanDuel, with Bird, with Eve, with a lot of my investments, where once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. So my goal for sort of phase one is let's get it out of the bottle. And I think the best way to do that is to start at a very local level. And so next year, my hope is to run bills in about half a dozen different cities around the country that would allow mobile voting for municipal elections. We're figuring out what cities they should be right now. There's different characteristics that are appealing. And then, my hope is that I can pass a few of those next year. But ultimately, what I'm sort of counting on is once someone has a better way to do it, it's kind of like that poll that I mentioned that Denver did, where 100% of people said, yeah, I prefer pressing a button. Once you see that other people have the right to do that, then not having it becomes a much, much greater thing. A lot of sort of behavioral economics and social norm theory, and people really fear actually deprivation more than anything else. And so it's like, oh, my cousin in this place is able to vote this way, why can't I? And then I say, because your politicians are corrupt. And they say, that sounds right to me. That then gives me the opening to go there. And look, let's be honest, you talked about small C conservatism, but big C may also be an issue here as well. So before the 2020 election, we polled mobile voting nationally. About 75% of independents, Democrats, and Republicans all said, yeah, if it's secure, we should be able to do this. Polled it again after 2020. We stayed in the 70s with independents and Democrats. We fell to the 40s with Republicans because of all of Trump's mishmash, right? And so in reality, might it be that this happens in blue cities and states before red? Yes. And while I'd like it to be everywhere, I'll take what I can get.
New York City on that list? Probably.
I would love it to be, but it doesn't look like, from what we can tell, that the city itself could do this. It would require Albany. And it's funny, Albany is extremely small C conservative, right? And extremely anti-reform, as we both know. And I kind of think that they may be one of the harder places in America to get through. And the cost of running that campaign would be probably the same amount of money it would cost me to run 5 other campaigns around the country. I care more about New York than anywhere else. A lot of the work that I do philanthropically, apart from mobile voting, is very focused on New York. But with all that said, no, not New York.
We are just a few minutes away from taking a couple audience questions, so be ready when the time comes. Just plant that seed right now. Do you know any cities that are probably on the list?
One of them that at least I'm most intrigued by is Atlanta. I'm actually going there next week, and I'm doing an event at the Carter Presidential Library about mobile voting with Martin Luther King III. He's got an essay in this book. He's a really big supporter of mobile voting because he believes that it's the best anti-voter suppression tool out there. That they want you to have to go somewhere so they can then have an excuse to turn you away. When you're pressing a button on your phone in your living room, they can't do that, right? And so in a majority minority city, Atlanta is particularly appealing. So there are majority minority cities that make sense. Colorado Springs, it's actually a very Republican city, and so therefore maybe it can't be done, but it's also the home of the Air Force. And I think people in the military are very familiar and very frustrated with how hard it is to vote, and therefore they may be receptive to it in certain ways. There are other cities like Minneapolis or Anchorage that have just historically been, moved faster towards choice voting, primaries and Final Five and that kind of stuff, and therefore they may be. So those are the kinds of places I'm thinking about.
So to garner more attention here, you have a whole list of events. You're going to be around the country over the next months. but you're trying to turn this into an actual sort of mass movement
Yes.
of people, especially speaking to younger generations.
Yep.
And trying to get younger generations to then say to mostly the older generations who are in power, we demand this? Is that fair to say?
I think it's the only way we're going to do it, right? Because ironically, mobile voting will unite Democrats, Republicans, lobbyists, unions, trade groups, everyone in power in opposition
Against
to
it,
this.
yeah.
So I remember when I was in law school, I had a professor named Abner Mikvo, which some people here may remember that name. And he was at the point in his life where his class was just him telling stories, which was awesome. And he told the story, I remember, where he was a young man, and Adlai Stevenson was running for president, and he wanted to volunteer in the campaign, and he lived in Chicago, and he walked into like the 47th Ward office, and the ward boss, Bill O'Sullivan, is sitting there smoking a cigar, feet on the desk, and Nicholas says, "Oh, I'm here because I want to volunteer for Stevenson." And O'Sullivan takes a long drag on the cigar, exhales, and says, "Well, who sent you?" And Nicholas says, "Nobody sent me." And O'Sullivan pauses again and says, "We don't want nobody, nobody sent." And that's unfortunately the way that it is today too. There's a reason why they put elections on really weird, inconvenient dates. They want to limit primary turnout. They want to limit general election turnout sometimes. So I think that it's going to take millions and millions of people standing up and demanding their rights for this to happen. But if you think about every meaningful movement in U.S. history, whether it's, status quo did not want to give women the right to vote, but eventually they were forced to. They didn't want to pass the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act or the American Disability Act. They didn't want to allow same-sex marriage. But in every case, enough people demanded their rights and fought for it long enough that they won. And I think we can do that here. And I think because of technology, in some ways, we have a tool that none of those other movements ever had. And so my hope is that I can use that tool to try to do this a little faster.
I'm going to turn it over to a couple audience questions in a second, but tell us the pitfalls, on the pitfall side of things. You still have to finish the tech and have it tested and have it in the app form that you want it to be in. There's this idea of foreign entities really eventually potentially being determined to muck things up if you're getting to an important enough level, or maybe just causing some chaos. Are there any other known knowns,
the other one
unknowns?
is just, it's more broad, but in many ways this whole thing is a behavioral economics experiment, right? I am making two bets. I'm betting that consumer behavior / voter behavior will change if we fundamentally change the means of voting. And then I'm betting that elected official behavior will change if we fundamentally change the makeup of their primary base, right? Neither of those things are going to happen overnight, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to have mobile voting elections, and immediately you're not going to get the kind of change I'm talking about. And all the critics say, "See, it doesn't work. We told you it wasn't going to work. This whole thing's a terrible idea. We should scrap it." And there will then even be bills to try to stop mobile voting and ban mobile voting. And so I already know that no normative change happens overnight. This stuff takes a while, and it's tricky because we live in a very, very impatient society. And I'm here with this book sort of saying I've got a better way, and I believe that I do. But at the same time, even my way is not going to deliver a new society overnight. It's going to take a while, and so that's probably the third pitfall.
Give me a little hand wave if you have a question. While we see about that, just answer one more thing. You mentioned there's some guest essays in the book. Just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we've got a lot of allies we're working with already, and so we asked a lot of them to contribute to the book. So Martin Luther King III has an essay in the book. Mark Riccobono, who's the president of the National Federation for the Blind, who's a big ally of ours, he's got an essay in the book. Josh Gottheimer, who is my brother-in-law and a congressman, and hopefully the next governor of New Jersey, has an essay in the book. Josh is running, don't tell anyone. David Hogg, who is the kid that kind of emerged from the Parkland shooting, is the real leader of Gen Z sort of political change. He's got the foreword to the book, and a lot of other people too. And so I was really lucky that people were just very generous with their time and willing to write these essays, and I think hopefully it gives the book kind of a, you gotta get tired of listening to hearing me write or talk or whatever it is. And so I think by giving section 4, the reader's like, hey, here's a break for me, and some people who are a lot more important than me, here's what they think, hopefully that adds to the book.
I'll take that for a second. So we'll take a few audience questions. I gave you the mic, sir. Let me just say ahead of time to everybody, please, no long speeches, in these events. Just try to ask your question, and then we'll see if we can get to a few people, and then we'll mingle a bit more, and Bradley will sign books and talk with, I'm sure, anybody who wants to talk individually. But sir, go ahead.
How do you filter the citizenship requirement through your app?
Well, you have to be a registered voter. Thank you. That was a brief question. The other night we did one, and the guy said, I have a comment and a question. 20 minutes later, we were still waiting for the question. So thank you. Look, you can't register to vote if you're not a citizen, and the app won't let you vote. It won't even show you the ballot unless you're verified to be the voter in that particular jurisdiction. And so by definition, you would get stuck in the process at the very beginning and couldn't get through any of it without being a citizen.
Hi, Bradley. So it's been observed that political reforms to election and votings can also change the way that political discourse occurs and also how campaigns are run. Proportional representation, instant runoff voting. I'm wondering if mobile voting was to be adopted as a widespread method of voting, how might that change our political discourse and campaigns?
Yeah, I think a lot like ranked choice voting in this particular case. So the arguments for ranked choice voting is that it changes, like you said, the discourse of an election itself. It promotes A, more civility, B, more moderate, and more centrism, because you're hoping that even if you're not the first place choice of voter, maybe you're their second or third or even fourth. And so, and by the way, the very first sort of reform that we built into the technology was ranked choice voting, because I truly believe that the combination of the two is incredibly powerful. And so I think generally speaking, whenever you're moving from a small turnout number of people who tend to be extreme to a broader group, by definition, it's the same way that you see politicians kind of moderate in the general election, right? They go very extreme in the primary, and then all of a sudden they become centrist. I think the same thing happens, but it happens immediately instead of the second time around, simply because the higher math just argues for a different approach to the campaign.
My question is about the open source
Yeah.
side of this. So you said you're going to put it out there once it passes all
Yeah.
the tests and everything. How do you see it existing as an open source project? Like, is it okay if Dominion comes, takes it, builds it into
Yes.
their platform, and makes money off of
Absolutely,
it, and
absolutely.
never touches the open source side again, or does it go on?
Totally. Look, I don't know if it's going to GitHub or where it's going to go, but it'll be out there. And then, and I recognize that I spent a lot of my money to help make other people money, right? And arguably I'm an idiot for that, but so be it. And there's basically two things that could happen. Either a government could say, you know what, we don't need Dominion. We can take this code and sort of put in our specific needs and put it out there. That's totally fine. Or more likely, they will say, Dominion or ESNS or Run Back or Democracy Live or whoever it is, just as you provide all these other services to us, we want you to provide this as well. And they have access to our code, and we're happy also to get the phone with them wherever they need to help them. And I recognize that, that might be very profitable for them. Although I will say, as a venture capitalist, it's a bad industry. Like, I would never invest in an elections company as an early stage tech startup. None of them are become. The only time Dominion ever sniffed $1 billion is when Rupert Murdoch had to pay them $800 million, right? So we're not election providers. I don't want to be an election provider. And so, we're basically building this for other people to then use and potentially profit from.
Once this is up and running, and someone loses, and then they start saying, "Oh, it wasn't secure."
Sure.
Is that how you hope to make your money?
How so?
Suing them,
Like Dominion.
like Dominion.
Oh, I don't know. I won't have an entity to do the lawsuit. Maybe. Although interestingly, Section 230, which we have a whole separate forum on, depending on where someone defames someone else, they may or may not be liable. But I think you're absolutely right. You kind of speak to a broader point though, which is people who lose, we have thanks to Donald Trump, but also, the Democrats are behaving badly too. We have developed this very now bad habit of claiming fraud and claiming election irregularities. So the Heritage Foundation, which is a really conservative think tank, right? they did a study of how many votes are actually in some way impacted by fraud, and here was their answer: 0.00006% of votes. So basically zero. So the cognitive dissonance between all of the claims of this stuff, a lot of it driven by Trump, and the reality. And look, I worked in Chicago politics. It was ugly, it was brutal. I had to testify in multiple corruption trials. It was a mess, but I still never saw a single example of voter fraud there. Sir?
Yes, you said that a person in the app would not be able to vote if they were not a citizen.
Yeah.
How exactly is that going to happen when you have jurisdictions that aren't vetting people as to whether or not they are citizens today? In other words, you have the ability to register to vote when you get a driver's license. Illegal aliens that are in the country are able to get a driver's license in many jurisdictions, and if they check the box that says they're a citizen and they wish to register to vote, what in your app is going to stop that from happening?
Yeah, so look, we can't replace all of the boards of elections, election offices, and all of that. Like, we still have to assume that to a certain extent they're doing their jobs, and one of their jobs is to ensure that people who don't have citizenship aren't voting. So if you have a wildly corrupt or incompetent election office, yes, that's still a problem. And you've got that problem whether it's vote by mail, you've got that problem whether it is voting in person or anything else. However, there are other databases that we could link to very easily that would provide additional checks and redundancy. And I don't think it would be hard to do it. It wouldn't be our choice. It would be up to that election jurisdiction. So if they were determined to really screw everything up, maybe they would refuse to do that. But whether it's State Department records or birth records or whatever else, this would be probably the only way to do that. You have a follow-up? Yeah.
Would your app allow jurisdictions that required identification in order to vote to be able to vet that in the app?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any, so every jurisdiction requires something, right? But yes, we have the ability for people to upload their driver's license to check their ID. We've got, again, I think even better than that, because that could still be faked in some way, is your fingerprint or facial recognition scan, and we've got that. So look, you could argue that one of the causes we should take on here is also identification requirements for each jurisdiction. My view is like that's just what I'm doing is hard enough already. We're trying to do that on top of it. But my hope would be that given that so many of us now are used to opening up our phone with a facial scan, that won't be sort of anathema. Look, I was an early investor in Clear, and early on people were really unsure about that technology, and now the Clear line at the airport's longer than the TSA pre-check line. So I do think that people adapt very quickly to new technologies. So my hope, sounds like you might agree with this, is that actually the jurisdictions use the most stringent biometric screening possible, because that's the best way to ensure that you're you.
Last one for now.
Yes. My firm ran the New York City school board elections until the Mayor Bloomberg got the school boards turned back to mayoral control. And we use ranked choice voting in proportional representation. Ranked choice voting makes so much sense to me. I've been advocating since I was 12 years old. In Alaska, you have an election where a candidate wins without having to have a runoff. And it's so simple. Why do you think there's so much opposition to something that's not that exotic and doesn't really seem to challenge anybody except common sense? Thank you.
The same reason they're going to oppose us, and that they oppose open primaries and they oppose everything else, which is they like things the way they are because they know how to win in the current system, right? It is very hard to make, to your point, a logical, credible argument against ranked choice voting from a policy standpoint. So effectively, the answer is it's not good for me, and what they do is they just refuse to entertain it in the first place. And by the way, I'll tell the story, maybe I shouldn't tell the story publicly, but of how ranked choice voting came to happen in New York City. In part it was, me and a friend of mine, Howard Wolfson, were in a meeting with Corey Johnson, who was the city council speaker, and Corey was picking our brain on running for mayor, and he said, what do you guys think of ranked choice voting? And we're like, you're a really likable guy, it'd probably be pretty good for you. And the next thing we know, the city council is passing this thing. So even when it does happen, it's probably happening for very specific political reasons. But look, I agree with you fully. We should have it absolutely everywhere.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Bradley, for
Yeah,
being
thank
here.
you guys. I really appreciate it. And sign some books.
Please visit the back table there and visit Bradley and get a book and sign a book.
Cool. All right, man. Thank you. That was fun. Yeah, that was really good.